Something that we noticed as we were doing that research is that there's been a pretty distinct lack of private action. And so when we started imagining what private action would look like and what the vehicle for private action would best be, we turned towards corporate social responsibility. And you'll hear me refer to it as CSR throughout the presentation. So I started taking a look at the predominant models of CSR, and as I found out, there's hundreds of models of CSR, both domestically and globally. Rather than focusing on all the different applications and how it could look like, we decided to try and identify what the predominant principles of CSR were. What we found were that in engaging with CSR, corporations are really seeking to promote business practices that minimize harmful outcomes, and those harmful outcomes generally focused around economic, social, and environmental factors. And then for purposes of better approaching these different sectors in need of corporate responsibility, a popular European organization, Business in the Community, has helped to broadly identify 4 spheres in which corporate performance could be displayed. And that's community, workplace, marketplace, and environment. When we started the project, we wanted to take a look at who the major investors in cannabis were. Once we had identified who those stakeholders were, we turned to their websites and all of their outward-facing media to see what CSR initiatives they had going on. And we also categorized the businesses by their dominant practices to get a better sense of who they were and what they were doing in the market. And then using that data, we began to develop CSR guidelines and interventions that would be most helpful in supporting what was already happening in the industry, focusing on social justice. Ultimately, the project has identified that, as you can probably predict, there is a distinct lack of CSR initiatives in the cannabis industry, specifically among the largest investors. By engaging in effective CSR, I believe that corporations have the potential to reinforce and build upon the restorative justice efforts, likely making them even more successful. So when we looked at all the major investors, they fell into 4 major categories listed on this screen. Of those companies, most of their websites did not mention corporate social responsibility initiatives at all. And those that did focused mainly on initiatives that didn't really interact with criminal and social justice efforts. They were largely targeted towards environmental initiatives. I'd like to give credit where credit is due. There are some small, medium-sized enterprises that are participating in prioritized hiring. So it's also worth noting that many of these companies that are moving into newly developed recreational markets are taking actions that threaten small business and also threaten genuine participation by those participating in social equity programs. In Massachusetts, we've seen a marked increase in mergers and acquisitions, specifically by large-scale operations seeking to acquire additional licenses through smaller businesses. And this trend has been common in many of the other states with recreational markets. In states that are seeking to legalize, there continue to be pushes against social equity programs. So I don't really want to belabor this point, but I do want to talk about some of the most common and likely barriers to CSR in the industry. So obviously, stigma surrounding the industry has investors hesitant to pursue more novel business approaches. And we've also seen some of the major investors in the industry publicly come out and say that these issues are too complex for them to deal with on their own, and therefore haven't warranted substantial attention. And lastly, of course, the federal status of cannabis prevents B Corp accreditation. They've sent out a formal statement stating that they will not accredit any institutions that deal with recreational cannabis, while they will interact with medicinal cannabis. And then, of course, traditional sources of small business funding are extremely limited, and the lack of interaction with banks encourages operation of a predominantly cash business. In making the business case for CSR, I think that it's easy to say that we should be looking at proactive solutions rather than retroactive, and I think that collective industry action is probably one of the most promising areas that I've seen any development. So rather than individual companies looking at these problems and trying to address them one by one, instead gathering themselves, identifying the gaps in the industry, and then promoting action as a collective unit. Lastly, I'm going to turn to some recommendations as to what I think this should look like. And I think in the short term, the best possible thing for corporations is to follow exactly what's happening in the industry. They have the resources and the funding to potentially push forward expungement initiatives. I also think that they could really directly participate by prioritized hiring, specifically community members from disproportionately policed areas, people who have been formerly incarcerated. And I think it goes beyond just hiring. I think it means making sure that those jobs are sustainable by ensuring the health benefits, childcare, and other individualized needs that people who have been harmed by the war on drugs may require. They could also provide funding or business development services to equity participants, and we've seen that in some of the cases of the equity incubators, but I think that they could even go above and beyond. And then lastly, drug policy is so much bigger than just cannabis and expands beyond just cannabis, and I think funding research to develop better drug policy could definitely be a route where corporate participation could improve the industry. So in the long run, I think that corporations really need to focus on systemic outcomes. I think that they need to center the support of disproportionately policed communities, and they need to support better drug policy, as I said. And I think that that needs to be done through collective action. The industry, rather than fighting against equity programs and being completely counterproductive to social justice initiatives, should be supporting regulated industry standards for social, economic, and environmental responsibility. I hope that they prioritize social and economic foremost, because I think that that's where the majority of the harm has hit from the war on drugs. And I think that also really centers around some of the issues we've seen with working conditions for people going into the cannabis industry.